makes nails on a chalkboard sound so terrible? What makes a choir sound angelic? Why do we love some sounds and hate others? The sciences of acoustics, behavioral psychology, and music theory can help explain why we have such specific taste when it comes to sound. Acoustics can tell us why spaces echo and how one pitch may seem higher than another, even though sound is ineffable and intangible. Human behavioral psychology lets us into the world of how sound affects us, taking into consideration how individuals develop nuanced tastes and connotations of sound based on their life experiences. Music theory attempts to bridge this acoustic and behavioral gap, explaining why sounds are pleasing in a scientific manner and teaching us how to replicate certain sounds via music notation. These three fields combine to explain the unique behavioral reactions individuals may have to certain sounds. Since our perception of sound is colored by our life experiences, it is sure that no two listeners will feel the same way towards a given sound. To put it simply, sound, like light, is energy. Sound waves are compressions of molecules in a given medium, also known as mechanical waves. These mechanical waves, as we call them, are actually pulses of energy moving through molecules. They have both compressions, or spaces of high pressure, and rarefactions, the low pressure segments between the compressions. Sound can move through matter, solid, liquid, or gas. Imagine tapping on a wooden table. The sound moves through the wood just as it would move through the air. The denser the molecules, the further the energy will travel, which is why a whale call will carry so far in water. Unlike photons or light particles, which do not need a medium to move through, sound cannot travel without a medium. This is why there is no sound in the vacuum of space. Without a medium to move through, the energy of sound waves cannot travel. Generally, acoustics studies the causes of sounds, their travel or propagation, and their reception. Propagation is a matter of physical acoustics, the pressure of the disturbance moving through its medium. These sound waves have two key characteristics, frequency and amplitude. Frequency describes how many waves pass by in a given time frame. That's how close together or far apart our compressions are. Higher frequency waves are more crowded together. Frequency determines the pitch of the sound relative to other sounds. A high pitch is caused by a sound wave with a high frequency. A low pitch is caused by a sound wave with a lower frequency. Frequency is measured in hertz, with human hearing ranging from 20 hertz at the lowest to 20,000 hertz at the highest. Wave frequencies above 20,000 hertz are referred to as ultrasonic, or above the threshold of human hearing. Wave frequencies less than 20 hertz are considered infrasonic. This diagram helps us to visualize how to plot a mechanical wave on a graph compared to how they actually behave. Where we once had compressions, we now have wave crests, and where we once had rarefactions, we now have troughs. This graphic plot adds a dimension that we cannot see in our first diagram, amplitude. Amplitude describes how high and deep the wave troughs are. Amplitude determines the amount of energy in the wave, or its loudness, and is measured in decibels. A sound wave with a deeper trough will be at a higher decibel, and will seem louder to our ears. The waves will also carry further through their medium, which means that a sound at a higher decibel can be heard from farther away. Because pitches can be understood as waves or pulsations that can be assigned a mathematical number, in hertz, two pitches with waves that line up mathematically will sound good together. This is because the waves or pulsations determining the pitch line up neatly with one another, complementing each other in the air. When two pitches complement each other in this way, they are said to be in phase with one another. Sound waves that are in phase will stack onto each other. Sound waves that are the same frequency but are exactly offset so that their troughs and crests do not nest are considered out of phase, and they will cancel each other out. Sound waves that do not match in any way will create a more irregular sound. An example of this is A440, or the pitch we hear when a sound is 440 hertz. A220 is half this pitch, so it sounds lower. The wavelength is proportionally half. A880 is twice the pitch of A440 and 4 times the hertz of A220, making the sound proportionally higher. We assign the letter A to this pitch for musical reasons, which we will get to in a bit. If we were to play these three sounds at once, they would complement each other perfectly because their wavelengths are perfect divisions of one another. They are the same pitch, but at different octaves. This process is known as harmonics. When a note is played, it may naturally produce sounds like these octaves, or an octave plus a fifth, to create what are known as overtones. These are almost like echoes of the fundamental pitch, produced by the vibrations of whatever originated the pitch, for example, a guitar string. At each higher frequency, the overtone becomes weaker. They are often difficult for the untrained ear to hear. To understand the psychology of sound, we must first understand hearing. Hearing is a crucial means of survival for animals, so human beings have evolved to do it very well. Hearing involves sound waves from the world traveling through the outer, middle, and inner ear. The vibrations hit the eardrum and are transformed into electrical signals by an organ called the corti, which travel to the brain to be interpreted as sound. A sound wave will pulse against the eardrum, changing its resting pressure. This pressure travels through the cochlea and is changed into an electric signal by means we have yet to understand. The signal travels to the cochlear nerve, which connects the two cochlear nuclei on the same side of the brain as the ear where the sound waves entered. Sound signals travel from this part of the brainstem upwards into the superior olive, which interprets the direction of the sound. The superior olive then sends the signals onto the inferior colliculus, a junction at the top of the brainstem where all sound that's already been screened by the superior olive for directionality meet. Then signals are sent to the thalamus. The thalamus receives signals and then processes them with neurons, then sends them to the primary auditory cortex. There, the signals are finally interpreted with the help of the other cortical areas that specialize in sound perception. Knowledge of this process can tell us why we hear a sound, immediately react to it, and then realize what it is. For example, hearing a sound from the foot of your bed, then getting spooked, and then realizing it was the thump of your cat jumping to the ground. Direction is processed first, then reaction, then identification of sound. Based on our established understanding of sound waves, we can begin to understand why some sounds are unsatisfying to us. A wave that is regular and uniform is more likely to be experienced as a single tone, while a wave that is jagged and irregular is more likely to be experienced as noise. We established earlier that sound waves are defined by the characteristics of frequency and amplitude. The third dimension of sound, however, is timbre. Timbre describes how many frequencies of the tone are perceptible. As we described earlier, overtones are the barely there vibrations above a fundamental pitch. A richer timbre means more overtones can be heard, which makes for a more pleasing sound. Certain instruments have notably different timbres, and people often pick their favorite instrument based on this. Mine is the French horn, but clarinet is also up there. They both have very warm timbres. Understanding these aspects of sound are the three cortexes' jobs. Our understanding of a sound is stacked upon the three cortexes. The primary cortex interprets frequencies for pitch and volume. The secondary cortex interprets harmony and rhythm. And the tertiary cortex sorts auditory information in terms of appreciation and integration. So if you don't like a certain singer's voice, blame your tertiary cortex. Speech tends to produce more intense activity on the left side of the auditory cortex, while music, both playing it and hearing it, tends to produce more activity on the right side. There's evidence that our taste in sound is developed early in life, likely in the first 3 years of child development. By 4.5 months in gestation, a fetus can hear sounds, like its mother's heartbeat or voice. By 6.5 months in gestation, a fetus can recognize voices other than that of its mother, usually lower frequency sounds. By birth, a baby can recognize familiar and unfamiliar sounds, and by 4 months of age, a baby can identify a sound as speech or not speech. It is important to note that if a baby is slow to show these developments, they may develop hearing or speech impediments later in life. The Mozart effect, first researched by Alfred Tomatis in 1991, hypothesizes that children under 3 are made smarter by listening to Mozart. Recent studies, however, have uncovered that Herr Mozart's music is actually changing their mood and affecting their arousal at a young age, not directly impacting their intelligence. This is a great example of how one's taste in sound develops early, perhaps earlier than any one of us can remember. Music theory is quite a varied field, but it can be broken down to a few bare essentials. As we discussed, pitch is quite simply the lowness or highness of a tone. This is determined by frequency, which is measured in hertz. Middle C, for example, is exactly 261.626 hertz. A440, the pitch that most orchestras tune to, is exactly 440 hertz. We assign note names to these frequencies in order to keep track of them. In Western music theory, we organize pitches along octaves. Take A440 and A220. That's a perfect octave. We then evenly divide the octave into 12 tones. This is what our 12-tone scale sounds like. This scale sounds a little scary. So we can divide the scale further along a pattern of whole tones and half tones, where 1/12 of our scale is a half tone. The pattern can change depending on what key or mode you're in. So let's use a major scale, which follows a pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Here, wherever we have a whole step, we skip one of the tones. Now, our C major scale should sound like this. Now, we only have 7 tones, with 5 halftones that we've left unplayed. Those tones still exist in our scale, but we identify them differently. We have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C, but our unplayed notes are C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. The sharp denotes that this is one half tone above another note. If we are descending, we call it flat. But why not just use the full 12-tone scale and call it a day? Surely that's easier than this half and whole tone nonsense. If this was your argument, I would agree with you, but the answer is that the Western music notation system has been developing since before recorded history, and definitely before we knew what sound waves were. Ancient musicians didn't know the science behind why an octave sounds good. They just knew that it did. Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher, was one of the first Western thinkers to try to prove why certain tones were enjoyable. He threw out most of the pitches, trying to keep only the first tone, the fourth, and the fifth, as well as the octave. As you can imagine, ever since then, Westerners have been battling back and forth to quantify, notate, and change our perception of sound. Now let's put some tones together. An interval is the concept of relative space between two pitches. For example, there is space between middle C and A440, because middle C is 261.616 Hz and A is 440 Hz, an approximate difference of 180 Hz. Increase the difference in Hertz, and you'll increase the size of the interval. Intervals have different characteristics. For instance, if a wave's length fits together regularly with another wave, the sound will be consonant or pleasant. If the waves' lengths don't divide into each other well, then their sound will be dissonant or unpleasant. There is one interval name for every tone above your fundamental tone. For example, a minor second is an interval of just one step. A minor second interval could be C and C sharp, which is regarded as a very unpleasant interval. Because these wavelengths aren't very divisible, their waves clash together in the air and sound unpleasant when our ears pick them up. A major second, however, is slightly more mathematically acceptable, making for a slightly more pleasant sound. This would be a C and a D. It still clashes, but not so bad. Moving on to a minor third, the next interval up, which would be a C and a D sharp. these wavelengths complement each other better, so they make a more pleasant sound. It's a little sad, though. That's what I mean when I say each interval has a different characteristic. The way each wavelength complements each other is very different, resulting in unique combinations for each one. The most consonant intervals are called perfect intervals. They are fourths, fifths, and octaves. There is no such thing as a minor fourth or fifth, because these intervals can only be perfect. These perfect intervals are sometimes referred to as drones. Because their wavelengths complement each other so well, they seem to drone in our minds. For a chord, we add a third note in between one of our intervals. A major triad is a pleasant chord, while a minor triad seems a bit sad. The only difference is the middle note, the third. It's no longer a major third. It's been dropped a half tone, so now it is a minor third. Like intervals, triads have different characteristics. We can add a fourth tone to make what's called a seventh chord, which are even more complex, since there's 4 different wavelengths that all interact with each other in unique ways to each of their intervals. A well-trained musician knows exactly what progressions of these chords will sound good. In the 17th century, it was common for composers to follow sets of rules called part-writing rules, such as, you can never use a diminished fourth interval, they sound terrible, or your song must end with a major triad because it's satisfying. Part-writing rules taught you how to craft a perfectly consonant melody and then dress it up with perfectly consonant chords and intervals. After a while, though, part writing gets boring. It's like playing chess to make music. In the Romantic era, or the 19th century, composers began to experiment with expression and form, playing with these chords that were once considered off-limits to Mozart and Bach. Composers began to understand the complexity of these minor and diminished chords, adding them to their music to create more complex, emotional, and nuanced music. To this day, musicians still learn part-writing rules in their formal education so that they can create perfectly consonant songs, but also so that they know how to break the rules in intriguing new ways. What does all of this have to do with taste? More than you would think. The goal of this research is to understand where one's taste in a specific medium comes from, in order to better understand our reactions to that medium, both collective and personal. By analyzing the formation of taste in a field as varied as sound art, we can help individuals to understand where their tastes come from, break down the false standards of their aesthetic sensibility, experiment with other objects of taste, and eventually help them to influence their own tastes. Where does taste come from? I've tried my best to explain it here. Usually, it's a combination of factors, including interaction with the medium from an early age, formal and sensory input, and socialization and education with the medium. This is an important part of taste that I wish I could have explored more in this research. The fact that we are raised to like the things that we like. Our taste could be influenced by factors like social class, geographic area, cultural upbringing, and more. To analyze visual art in this way, we would use the science of light as our physical interaction with the medium, instead of sound waves. We would still have early childhood interactions with the medium. All visual media would be influential to an infant, just as all sound is influential. We would then have to take into consideration that infant's art education, if any. What images have they been exposed to throughout their life? Which ones stick with them? This, in combination with learned taste through social class and upbringing, will result in an entirely unique and nuanced opinion of art and visual media from person to person. By analyzing the formation of taste in this field, we can help arts organizations and institutions to better understand the wants and needs of their audience, to provide for those wants and needs, and to help the audience analyze their own personal tastes and where they come from. Unfortunately, some parts of human hearing and the human brain are black boxes, and we don't yet understand how tastes are made, remembered, and stored. For now, we will have to be satisfied with this little look into music theory,
Acoustics and Behavioral Psychology.